Fu adopted the boy legally and christened him William, Bill for short. His arrival in the household changed Fu profoundly. Having someone else to live for not only restored his old vitality, good spirits, and mental agility, it also transformed his moral character. How different he was now that he had a son to love and care for, a lad to whom he must be a good example. He would protect the boy and guide him and give him the best of everything. Fu took Bill everywhere with him. It's true that the sudden appearance of this adopted son did raise some eyebrows amongst the gossips in the colony. But most people were inclined to take the situation at its face value as a charitable act. And others said, well, if it was evidence of some peccadillo from the old man's past, well, what of it? And hadn't others done just as bad? And it did Fu's reputation no enduring harm. No longer did Fu merely pretend to be respectable. He really did become good. He was determined that the boy should never know anything of his former life, and all evidence of it was carefully concealed. He gradually began to divest himself of his criminal empire. He couldn't do this all at once, of course. He had to proceed with great caution. To move too quickly might precipitate chaos throughout the Orient. Fu began to take his empire to pieces. He took his money out of gambling, extortion, prostitution, and drugs, and diversified into a series of legitimate businesses. There was his worldwide chain of Chinese laundries, his feudal noodle shops, and he became a huge backer of the Hong Kong film industry. Life continued in great happiness for Bill and Fu for all those 10 years. Bill was a bright lad and did very well at school. He had a good heart and could never adequately express his gratitude to the dear old man who had raised him up. He loved him like the father he'd never known. It was a beautiful thing to see, the relationship between these two, the quaint old Oriental gentleman and the young boy who'd been saved from the streets. Fu had great hopes for Bill. The world would be his oyster. He could have any career he wanted. Fu sent him off to the best English boarding schools. He went on to Oxford and decided to round off his studies with a Master of Business Administration at Harvard. Maybe when he was finished studying, he could help look after Fu's legitimate business affairs. Both men felt the pain of these long separations when Bill was away at school and college. But both saw the necessity of them, and the tradition grew up between them that no matter what happened, they would always get together in Fu's big house in Hong Kong for Christmas dinner. Fu himself was very busy during this time. He found that to take his criminal empire apart was even more difficult than it had been to put it together. it was really a problem. Business had once again begun to occupy all his time, at a time in his life when he might have expected to be able to put his feet up and take it easy. It was now giving him more trouble than it had ever done before. Younger men were rising to challenge his authority. There were power struggles, internal wars, bits of the empire breaking off, external threats to it. The police were sniffing about. Interpol took advantage of his weakness to get on his trail. All Fu's efforts to free himself seemed only to get him more tangled up. It was all he could do to keep it from spinning completely out of control. And he was tired. His heart wasn't in it anymore. He knew he didn't have many more years left to him, and he was anxious that everything should be ship-shape and squeaky clean for handing over to William. He dreaded that William should ever know anything of his horrific criminal past. But despite all his best efforts, he couldn't get rid of his responsibilities. He was trapped in a web of his own making. One wrong move, and the Orient could be plunged into chaos. Fu feared not only for his own safety, but for the political stability of the entire region. And this was a burden he had to carry alone. On his visits home, young Bill, sensitive youth that he was, knew there was something troubling the old gentleman. But despite his gentle, if persistent inquiries, the old man would tell him nothing of what was in his heart. Bill was puzzled, and even a little hurt that Fu wouldn't confide in him. It cast a little shadow over their relationship. Of course, Fu would have liked nothing better than to unburden himself. How good it would have been to share his troubles with his dear adopted son. But of course, Bill must never know anything of it. Fu's only consolation at this time was that Bill suspected nothing of his criminal connections. And what a fine young man he was growing up to be. Yes, whatever else happened on Christmas Eve, Fu would come back from whatever far-flung post of his empire was currently occupying his attention, and Bill would fly home from Eton or Oxford or Harvard or wherever it was, and the two would gather around the traditional roaring log fire. The room had to be savagely air-conditioned to make this bearable. And there they would sip on their eggnogs and have a chinwag about the old times. Then, on Christmas Day, they would sit down to the traditional Christmas dinner with all the trimmings. Yes, this was all that made life worthwhile for Fu, and it was scarcely less eagerly awaited than by Bill himself. Fu dressed up in his Father Christmas suit. They had a Christmas tree with the coloured fairy lights and the angel on the top, the presents piled beneath. Then in came the roast turkey, followed up by the plum pudding in the flaming brandy sauce. Then, having pulled their Christmas crackers, they'd pass the afternoon watching the pantomime, which was always put on by the bodyguards and concubines. Then, after the panto, Fu and Bill would exchange their special presents. They liked to put it off as long as they could for the suspense of it. Father and son would exchange gifts and then fall weeping into each other's arms, recovering in that moment the original hug they'd shared all those years ago. Most of the concubines were pensioned off now, except for a few kept on as maids and serving wenches. The bodyguards had of necessity to be kept on, but they were discouraged from hanging around the place playing dice and billiards, and were given various useful employments. Some became gardeners. Others were taught trades, such as carpentry and plumbing. In a world gone mad and cynical, full of wars, revolutions, and natural disasters, where Christmas was everywhere trivialized and commercialized, Fu and Bill were an island of peace and sanity. In the evening, arm in arm, brimming over with heartfelt joy, they'd go out onto the balcony and look down on the lights of Hong Kong. There was never any need for words between them at this time. They were perfectly united in their feelings. There would be a moment of sadness, for the bitter must always be mixed with the sweet. But then, in a great soaring moment, they would feel the bond of closeness between themselves, and then their hearts went out to all the people in the city below. And then it was as if they embraced all of poor, struggling, suffering humanity. It was almost as if they could see the message of Christmas writ high in the tropic sky. Peace on earth, goodwill to all men. Then the Mongol bodyguards would break into a rousing chorus of "Hark the Herald Angels Sing," or some other charming Christmas carol or popular song. And then it was off to bed for everyone after a perfect Christmas day.
child should be mild, obedient, good as he. For he is our childhood's pageant, day by day, like us he grew. He was little, weak and helpless, tears and smiles like us he knew. And he feeleth for our sadness, and he shareth in our gladness.
The 13th Christmas was approaching. Things were going badly for Fu. His empire was on the verge of civil war. Each day brought rumors of mutiny and revolution. Knives flashed in back alleys. Fu felt old and tired. He didn't feel up to it anymore. His enemies were closing in on him. He feared for his life. He knew he should leave Hong Kong, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Bill would be so disappointed if they missed out on their Christmas dinner. One more Christmas was all that Fu asked for. Just one more Christmas with Bill. Fu called in his astrologers and soothsayers. The omens were dire. He read in the newspapers of earthquakes and volcanoes, as if the earth itself was witnessing the fall of a great man. Some of his bodyguards deserted. His hounds turned away from him, whining when he walked in the garden. The huge iron gates at the front of the house suddenly fell off their hinges. The magnificent chandelier in the banquet hall came crashing to the floor. Bill, too, had a premonition of trouble as he flew home from the Harvard Business School. There was something in the air, something disastrous. Flights were delayed, connections missed. For the first time ever, he wouldn't make it in time for Christmas dinner. He tried to telephone Fu. Someone picked up the receiver. Then there was silence. Then the phone was hung up. Bill dialed again and again, and now the phone was dead. What was going on? He reached Hong Kong on Christmas morning. There was nobody to meet him. Something was wrong, dreadfully wrong. He knew it in his bones. He took the taxi up the hill, beset by growing fear. What were the gates doing, lying off their hinges like that? He paid off the taxi driver and ran up the gravelled drive. There, right in the middle of the drive, were Fu's faithful hounds, all with their throats cut. There was nothing he could do for them. He ran on. All around him now, the grounds were littered with the bodies of the bodyguards, all cruelly murdered. And mingled with their bodies were the bodies of other men, evil-looking men in ninja suits. And though it meant nothing to him at the time, he noticed that each of these men had inscribed on the back of the left hand an intricate tattoo. Only later would he learn that this was the sign of a certain notorious Shanghai snakehead who had chosen this moment to overthrow Fu. He reached the house itself, stumbling over the bodies which spilled through the doorway and littered the hall. What an appalling sight it was that met his eyes. Massacre and reeking carnage greeted him on every hand. He made it through to Fu's own private suite. There were bodies everywhere and signs of terrific struggle. But Fu himself was not to be seen. Perhaps the old man had escaped this foul slaughter. Bill was about to run from the house when he remembered that there was one room he hadn't checked, the great banquet hall. With a feeling of profound dread, he hurried to that room. The oak door had been shivered by some tremendous blow. Inside, it was a shambles. The lovely Christmas decorations all torn from the walls and trampled underfoot. The chairs and tables overturned. The chandelier shattered on the floor. On the table was the ruins of the Christmas feast. The turkeys, the mince pies, the plum puddings and the Christmas cakes, all in mad disarray. And at the far end of the room, the Christmas tree on its side, its myriad little fairy lights still twinkling pathetically, and the presents were strewn everywhere. The horrified young man made his way around the table, examining the bodies. There was no sign of Fu's. There was many a faithful and beloved retainer, and the sight of these broke a sob from the sensitive youth. But of Fu himself there was not a sign.